Hi, I'm Thomas Schumacher. I'm president-producer of Disney Theatrical, and I'm excited to share some ideas with you today. You know, when you look back over the many years of Disney Theatrical, and I look at my own part of it, it's an extension really of an almost 34-year career at Disney. So coming from the theater into working in animation and then actually building a theater division at the same time that we were running an animation division, many things blur together. But there's no question that more than any one title, the big takeaway are the artists, right? The people that we've been able to work with. And whether it's people from the States and so many people from here, I mean, if you actually look at the list, it's remarkable as we sit here in London, the number of not just shows we've done here, but productions with Brits, frankly. It's really working with all these artists that's probably the highlight of it all. There's been a lot of conversation about how many Disney titles can fit into one market. And in New York, what's clear is it's not Disney titles, it's the similarity of theme that might become too crowded. So as you look at productions, and as I look at, for example, as you know, as people know, we did Elton John and Tim Rice's Aida, which doesn't necessarily compete with shows like a Frozen or like a Lion King or like a Beauty and the Beast. But when you have multiple of the fantasy titles that gear more towards the broadest family audience, you have to be mindful of the fact that there's only so many people. And coming out of the pandemic, with a substantial reduction in tourists in New York, that changes the whole audience makeup completely. So I don't even know if there's a rule that says 2 works, 3 doesn't. I think it's really all about the conditions in the marketplace at that time. And that would apply to New York, it applies to London. Slightly different in Japan, where you probably know that we have many, many shows running throughout the country, but it's a very small country. As you look at each of the titles we've done, you then see a trajectory around the world. Sometimes we have brought productions directly here, in the case certainly of Lion King, certainly Beauty and the Beast, certainly Aladdin. I'm here today in the theater on opening day of Frozen. So obviously these are titles we've brought that are, for the most part, these shows are extensions of the Broadway launch. We've also done it in reverse in our great partnership with Cameron Mackintosh. We started Mary Poppins here in London and then took that to the US, then did the US tour, then did the UK tour. So, you know, there's a different model for each one. Some of the shows we've done have not come here, but have played very strongly around the world. Certainly you could go to Japan today and see a Little Mermaid that isn't the Broadway Little Mermaid, but in fact is a Little Mermaid that we created specifically first for the Netherlands and then on into Japan. Newsies has played broadly around the US, both on Broadway, on tour, and then in various nonprofits and things like that. And there's always been conversation about Newsies here, but you have to have the right market, the right conditions have to apply. So it's really horses for courses and figuring out what's going to fit in what market, at what time, and what's available. It seems to me that when I think about what would fit here, we now have to take into consideration the giant shift in the marketplace that has come out of the pandemic. And I'd be disingenuous to say that the 5-year plan that we had laid out 2 years ago, before the pandemic, still applies today. So I think we take it as it comes and we see what's happening. Certain titles that we've done before, ironically, we are already reviving. So here in the case of Beauty and the Beast, I've been toggling between London with Frozen, Lion King, Mary Poppins, and then out to Bristol to work on an all-new production of Beauty and the Beast that has a future in all sorts of places around the world. And I'm in work right now for a, if you will, revisal of Aida. So we're taking that great score, that Tony Award-winning score by Elton John and Tim Rice, and reimagining certain segments of the show. 20 years on, we see the story slightly differently. Each time you approach a new show with an all-new creative team, you know, in this case, I had never worked with Christopher Arm or Michael Grandage. I had known Jennifer Lee, our book writer, and certainly Kristen Anderson Lopez and Bobby Lopez I knew separately from our life in New York. And Neil Austin, our lighting designer, I had done Shakespeare in Love with here. So some people are we're totally new when we began this, some people that I knew, but joining with this team to put Frozen up has been a great adventure. You know, we started, you know, a number of years ago, of course with labs and workshops, and we did a production in Denver, and then brought it into New York, and then we opened a US tour. And so, you know, and now having been able to work on it in multiple places, as you know, it's already playing in Japan. It opened in June. I was in Australia to launch a glorious production of it in Sydney that is now, at this moment in time of this interview, on deck waiting to reopen in Melbourne in the middle of a lockdown. So Frozen's journey, you know, getting it going and then having the pandemic really hit it hard, has meant we've had to adjust all over the place. So that's an interesting thing when you set it against what my dear friends Andrew Lloyd Webber and Madeline Lloyd Webber have done with the Theatre Royal Drury Lane. I mean, this space, you know, I've been here so many times over the years, and I walked it as it was beginning construction with Andrew and Madeline, and hearing their dreams of what they could do, and sitting in seats with virtual glasses on to see what new perspectives would be. So to build this specific production, which is site-specific for this theater, at the same time they were building the theater, at the same time shops were closed, couldn't get things built or made. It's been a wild ride, and we've ended up with this spectacular cast in a physical production that is will only ever be seen in this space, and that's a joy beyond all measure. People think of us as Disney on Broadway, but there's actually 23 shows we will have running by the time we get to the end of this calendar year. 2 of those are on Broadway. 2 more are on tour in the US, and then the other 19 are around the world. So it's a global business. We adapt the shows and create the shows for each space. Within that, we also let the shows breathe. So in the case of Beauty and the Beast, if you were to come with me tonight to Bristol and watch the show, and then play the cast album from the original production in 1994, they don't match. There's 2 songs on the cast album that are not in the show. There is a song in the show that's not on the cast album, A Change in Me, which was added originally for Toni Braxton and then has stayed with the show. In the case of The Lion King, it's roughly 12 to 15 minutes shorter today than it was when it opened, because on the 10th anniversary, we made some trims and adjustments. And in this show, there's one song, Frozen, there's one song, Extracted, that came at the very late in the second act. And we've added a new song, I Can't Lose You, towards the beginning of the second act. And that's just because shows are breathing, living things. And we don't consider them, if you will, frozen. When you think about what we do, for the most part at Disney Theatrical, not always, not everything is based on a pre-existing title of ours. As you know, people know, when we did Aida with Elton John and Tim Rice, we based it on the fundamental story of the opera Aida, but as actually adapted by Leontine Price for a children's book she had written about what her thoughts were on Aida's backstory. So we had different source material for that than an animated movie. We did Peter and the Starcatcher, which got a great deal of attention. New York has been mounted all over the world. And again, that was based on a book published through Disney Publishing, but not a Disney animated title. But when we go to those Disney animated titles and adapt them, of which we've done many, not all of them seen here, keep in mind that animation is brief. Frequently, those original movies were less than the length of a first act of a Broadway show. And I've said this before, but I stick to it, that animation is almost haiku storytelling, that we can use very brief statements, very beautifully framed visuals that help you follow the story, but that we don't have to go into the great depth that you would in a proper stage musical. So if we apply that thought here to Frozen, by having Jennifer Lee, who co-directed and wrote the screenplay to the original film, Frozen, and Bobby Lopez and Kristen Anderson Lopez, who did those glorious songs, when we came together, we said, what story things were left out of the movie? what depth have you thought about that we want to share with these characters? So if we look at Elsa, she's so identified in the movie for the song Let It Go, but we've expanded the whole coronation sequence so that you understand, and I think it's one of the most glorious things that Bobby and Kristen wrote, is the big choral sections and how we learn about what Elsa's thinking during her coronation. The same thing is done in the second act when Elsa sings a song called Monster, responding to this thing that Wesselton shouts at her, she's a monster. What is the nature of Monster? What is the nature of this power she has, this curse that she has? And as she explores that in Monster, it's deep. And if you actually read through Kristen's exquisite lyrics, you get a real view into who Elsa is and what she's thinking. The depth that we get to go to with these characters it's much deeper, it's much richer in a stage version for obvious reasons. We're a 2-act structure. It's a different medium, and we get to take a deeper look into it. And for me, certainly moments that really rise up are things like the coronation, because you don't know it. And even fun novelty songs like Huga, which is a curtain raiser for the second act. We get to take a little tiny scene from the movie with Oaken, this trader who's halfway up the mountain as they're going and they need supplies. And we can expand it into a kind of a curtain raising fun number. That's what we're supposed to do with a theatrical musical. The Lion King is so important to all of us who were there in the very, very, very beginning. I've worked on Lion King pretty much every week of my life since November of 1990, when I started on the original film. I've been involved in everything Lion King, every sequel, every remake, and of course, it would be, ridiculous to suggest that being part of the creation of this global phenomenon, and particularly the stage version, and working with Julie Taymor and the fantastic team, Garth Fagan, and of course my beloved friend Lebo M, and of course Elton and Tim, and everybody, everyone who's been part of it, is it's an honor, but it's a huge responsibility. It's a huge responsibility. It's a responsibility to deliver that show of the appropriate scale for each place we do it for the audience. And we've done it in smaller versions, we've done it in giant versions, always Julie Taymor's vision, but we've adjusted it so that it can reach the largest possible audience. So that's a responsibility, but it's also a responsibility to the people who are making the show. And that's complicated because it's an extraordinary circle, if you will, of people who gather to create this. The people on stage, the people off stage, the makers who make those exquisite puppets and masks and costumes, the orchestra who play all manner of instruments. It's a huge responsibility for safety. It's a huge responsibility for how they get to and in the space itself for these audiences all over the world. And I don't take any of that lightly. So in the middle of this pandemic, which cannot be denied as a giant piece of the narrative of how anyone looks at the theater today, because you think of it from the audience point of view, and you have to think of it from the cast, crew, and orchestra point of view. To be on the stage at the Lyceum, where we've been playing for over 20 years with The Lion King, was deeply emotional at the end of July when we opened, or reopened. Also because we'd had problems during the rehearsal process, with having to shut down, cohorts of the team not being able to rehearse because we wanted to protect people, or people had gotten sick or had tested positive. To gather on that stage with not as much rehearsal time as we thought we would, and then literally the afternoon of the opening had a massive automation failure with a hydraulic piece that would have prevented Pride Rock from rising, which is the entire metaphor of the show. It was all hands on deck, and that team was so remarkable. I mean, I was in there 2 days before rehearsing the show without a cast, with swings covering 5 or 6 different parts in the course of one performance. To gather then with the full ensemble with the full set of principals, with a full crew and a functioning Pride Rock, was deeply moving, and it was glorious to be with that audience. And I have, like everybody else, I have watched videotape that was filmed, you know, not legally actually, but that I've seen that people have taken. And when Simba climbs Pride Rock at the end, and the music is rising, and he puts his foot onto the rock and begins that climb, the audience began to cheer, but at a level I have never heard, as they cheered him walking up those steps, in a sense as rising above the pandemic and moving forward into the future. Because in that moment, the story has jumped time, and he's going to walk up that and be joined by the future generation. And that metaphor was not missed by anybody in the house. The Lion King has played successfully in many, many, many markets, but we have to remember that that's because the source material played in these markets. The source material of The Lion King, the original Lion King film, directed by Rob Minkoff and Roger Allers, was translated into 32 different languages back in 1994, including Zulu. So whether you were in Haifa, Israel, and you saw it in Hebrew, or you were, you know, in France and you saw it in continental French, or you were in Canada and you saw it in Quebecois, right? Wherever you saw it in your local language, except that all that beautiful choral music by Lebo M from South Africa and Lebo's extraordinary chant at the top, it was always the same. That never translated. And I think there was something that joined us all in this community to this genuinely universal experience, because it wasn't American, it wasn't British, it was heard in local language. And because of that, it became the story of us, our communities, our families. And it also tells a truth that at the time people thought was very risky, which is to say, and if you will, the caravan moves on. Some people won't make it to the end, that you will face challenges, you will face loss, you will face fear, and you will face triumph and success. And all of these things come together in the great circle of life. And once you embrace that, you realize why people get it. Because if you're 7 years old when you see it, you see one version of the story. If you're 19 when you see it, you see a different version. If you're 45, a different version, and yet again, as you get older. And because it's played so long now, the audience itself has moved through it, right? So that, you know, if you were 12 years old when you saw it, you're in your 40s now. And that's just something that can't be taken away from it. Well, there's no question when I look at Mary Poppins that without the British sensibility and without that team, it wouldn't have happened. Curiously, the movie, as envisioned by Walt Disney, was made by Americans, right? The stories written by P.L. Travers were conflated into a version that people began to know around the world. But of course, I'm still very, very close to Richard Sherman. I knew his late brother, Robert, well, but Richard Sherman is someone I'm very close to. And I'm constantly in contact with him, reporting to him what's going on here. And you know, what they created for that score, that George Stiles and Anthony Drew were able to expand on, rethink, reimagine, I think in many ways people couldn't tell the difference. What was new, what was original. And that speaks to something in the magical power of Mary Poppins. And it also speaks to the vision of my friend Cameron McIntosh. Because when we came together, everyone said this would never work. People said, you know, shotgun wedding, it wasn't gonna happen. But the day we sat down, we'd known each other vaguely, but the day we sat down in December of 2001, in the wake of 9/11, so now almost 20 years ago, we shared notes and outlines. I handed him an outline of what I thought the story should be, and he handed me an outline of what he thought, and they were the same stories. Our ideas for expanding it, so that when Julian Fellowes came on, pre-Downton Abbey, pre his extraordinary fame and success, he was just a darn good writer. When Julian came in, when Richard Eyre came in, both of them new to me. When Bob Crowley came on to do sets and costumes, Cameron knew Bob well, and I knew Bob well. We'd done a number of shows together. And then Matthew Bourne, who I'd known for quite some time, but then I met Stephen Mear. And so as we all joined together, there's no question that without starting here, that show would not be what it is today. And of course, it's been seen everywhere and in different languages, but that fundamental heartbeat of it really relies on Pamela Travers, not a Brit, Australian, but it relies on that, and then as interpreted by all these artists. I think when people come to see Mary Poppins, it's hard for them to actually recall what is and is not from the original movie. We did not base the stage show on the movie. We based the stage show on the books and the film. But there's a fundamental element to the film, which is about Mary Poppins coming in to stabilize a family. So both in the original film, as imagined by Don DeGraudy, Bob Sherman, Dick Sherman, Walt Disney, by that notioning of the family and giving Winifred her story and how all that happens, the mother, and that Mary Poppins comes in. She doesn't arrive to save the children. She comes in to put the family right and then leave. That essence is, of course, the centerpiece of the show. And from there, we then go on a flight of fancy using many other stories by her, characters that we meet, Nelius and what have you, throughout it. But it's all to illuminate the power of Mary and the family. I will tell you a story and I will not reveal to you who it is, but when we first opened Mary Poppins, it was in the early days here in London, a very well-known British singer, songwriter, composer, member of a famous band, but now was a star on his own, came to see it. And at the end of the first act, we were in the Julie Andrews room at the Prince Edward Theatre, and he was visibly very moved. And I said, "Are you okay?" And he said, "Yes, but I've realized that I feel like Michael Banks. I feel like I was left behind when Mary Poppins leaves at the end of the first act and says I have to leave them on their own." And he said, "I felt that I wasn't heard as a child." And he was very moved by it. And at the end of the second act, we replayed the same moment, if you will, and he was quite visibly moved and shaken. And I said, "What is it now?" He goes, "Well, now I've realized I've become Mr. Banks and I'm not paying attention to my own children." And it was so beautiful that he could experience that journey with the show. And I think when you see it, you wish, all of us do really, that Mary Poppins could come